My name is Marcus Thompson, and I remember the exact moment I realized I was invisible to them. It was a Tuesday morning in October when I walked into Whitmore and Associates, the same way I had for the past 4 years. Same security badge, same elevator ride to the 7th floor, same coffee from the break room that was always slightly burnt. But something felt different that day. The air was heavier, charged with the kind of tension you feel before a storm. I had been the senior financial auditor at Whitmore for 3 years, promoted after spending my first year proving that I could outwork, outthink, and outperform every single person in my department. My audit reports were flawless. My detection rate for discrepancies was the highest in the company's history. I had saved Whitmore over $12 million in potential losses by catching fraudulent vendor contracts that everyone else had missed. None of that mattered to them. I settled into my desk, the one tucked in the corner of the open floor plan, far from the windows where the senior partners sat. My workspace was smaller than the interns' cubicles, but I'd stopped complaining about it after the 3rd time Richard Whitmore Jr., the CEO's son and my direct supervisor, told me I should be grateful for the opportunity. Grateful. That word followed me everywhere in that building. "Marcus, you're here early." The voice belonged to Patricia Holden, the office manager. She was standing at the edge of my desk with that smile she always wore when she was about to say something condescending. "You know, it's so impressive how dedicated you are." Where does that work ethic come from? I knew what she was really asking. She wanted me to perform my blackness for her, to give her some story about growing up poor, about struggling, about overcoming. She wanted to feel good about herself for noticing how hard I worked. "Same place yours does." "Patricia," I said, not looking up from my computer. "Professionalism." She laughed nervously and walked away. I could feel her discomfort from across the room, and I didn't care. I had stopped caring about making white people comfortable in my first year at Whitmore, right around the time I realized that no amount of comfort I provided would ever translate into respect. The morning passed slowly. I was deep into the quarterly audit for the Morrison account, one of our largest clients, when Richard appeared at my desk. He was 28, 2 years younger than me, and had been my supervisor for exactly 18 months. His only qualification for the position was his last name. "Marcus, I need you in the conference room in 10 minutes, he said. "We're onboarding a new team member, and I want you to help get him up to speed." I looked up from my screen. A new team member? I wasn't informed we were hiring. Richard shrugged. It was a last-minute decision. The board felt we needed additional support for the upcoming fiscal year audits. "You'll be training him." "Training him to do what exactly?" "Your job." Richard said it so casually, so carelessly, that I almost missed the weight of those words. "Well, not your job specifically. Just helping out. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was, but I nodded anyway. "In that building?" Asking too many questions as a black man meant being labeled as difficult or aggressive or not a team player. I had learned to save my questions for moments when they mattered. The conference room was already full when I arrived. Seated at the head of the table was Richard Sr., the CEO himself, a man who had spoken to me exactly 3 times in 4 years. Next to him was his wife, Caroline, who served as the company's chief financial officer despite having no formal financial training. And across from them, looking like he had just stepped out of a fraternity recruitment poster, was a young white man with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that cost more than my monthly rent. "Marcus, perfect timing," Richard Sr. said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Have a seat. We were just telling Bradley about you." Bradley. Of course his name was Bradley. "Bradley Whitmore," the young man said, extending his hand. "Richard's cousin. I just graduated from state last spring, business major with a minor in communications." I shook his hand and felt my stomach drop. Whitmore. He was family. "Marcus has been with us for 4 years, Richard Sr. continued. "He's one of our best auditors. Very thorough, very meticulous." The way he said meticulous made it sound like an insult. "We thought it would be beneficial for Bradley to learn directly from you," Caroline added. "Shadow you for a few months, understand the audit process, get his feet wet." "A few months?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "That's a significant training period. Most new hires are integrated into the team within a few weeks." "Bradley isn't most new hires," Richard Jr. said, his tone carrying a warning. "He's family. We want to make sure he gets the best possible foundation." I understood then. Bradley wasn't there to learn from me. He was there to replace me. They were going to use my own expertise to train my replacement, and they expected me to smile and be grateful for the opportunity. "I'll do my best to bring him up to speed," I said. The meeting ended with handshakes and promises, and that particular brand of corporate enthusiasm that always felt hollow. As I walked back to my desk, Bradley trailing behind me like a golden retriever, I could feel the weight of what was coming. "So, Marcus," Bradley said, settling into the chair next to my desk, a chair that hadn't been there that morning. "What's the most important thing to know about this job?" I looked at him, this child who had been handed everything I had worked years to earn, and I made a decision in that moment. I would train him. I would teach him everything he needed to know. But I would also watch, I would document, and when the time came, I would be ready. "The most important thing," I said slowly, "is attention to detail. Everything in auditing is about the numbers. Numbers don't lie. People do." Bradley laughed like I had made a joke. I didn't. Over the next few weeks, I learned that Bradley Whitmore was spectacularly unqualified for the position he had been given. He couldn't read a basic balance sheet. He didn't understand the difference between accounts payable and accounts receivable. He asked me what fiscal year meant on his third day, but none of that mattered to the Whitmores. In their eyes, Bradley was perfect. He was family. He was one of them. I was something else entirely. The microaggressions became more frequent as Bradley's presence became normalized. Patricia started asking me to explain my work to Bradley in ways she never asked other team members to explain anything. Richard Jr. began CCing Bradley on emails that were meant only for me, as if Bradley's oversight was somehow necessary. In meetings, I would present findings only to have Bradley rephrase my exact words seconds later and receive praise for his insight. "Bradley, that's an excellent observation," Richard Sr. said during one particularly painful meeting. "Very sharp thinking." I had made the exact same observation 30 seconds earlier. No one had acknowledged it. The surveillance increased too. I noticed security guards lingering near my desk more often. My badge was randomly checked 3 times in 1 week, something that had never happened before. When I stayed late to finish reports, I would receive emails from HR asking why I was still in the building after hours. "We just want to make sure everyone is safe," the HR director, a woman named Sandra, told me when I asked about it. "You understand." I understood perfectly. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon, 6 weeks after Bradley's arrival. I was presenting my findings on the Morrison audit to the senior leadership team. I had discovered significant discrepancies in the account, nearly $400,000 in payments that didn't match any vendor invoices on file. It was exactly the kind of finding that had earned me my reputation for excellence. "These discrepancies require immediate investigation," I said. Pointing to my slide, "The payment patterns suggest either gross negligence or deliberate misappropriation of funds." Richard Sr. leaned back in his chair. "Those are serious accusations, Marcus." "They're not accusations, sir. They're findings. The numbers speak for themselves." "The numbers might speak," Caroline said. Her voice sharp, "but so do people. And people are saying you've been difficult lately, resistant to training Bradley, territorial about your work." I felt my jaw tighten. With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, I have trained Bradley to the best of my ability. My concern is with the integrity of our audits, not with interpersonal dynamics. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about, Richard Jr. interjected. That tone, that attitude, you're always so defensive. I wasn't being defensive, I was being professional, but I knew that distinction was invisible to them. I think we need to take a step back, Richard Sr. said, his voice carrying that particular condescension of a man who has never been challenged. Marcus, your work has been valuable, but I'm concerned about your fit with the team going forward. Bradley has shown tremendous promise, and frankly, his approach is more aligned with our company culture. There it was. The language of exclusion dressed up as corporate strategy. What exactly are you saying? I asked. We're restructuring the audit department, Richard Sr. replied. Effective Monday, Bradley will be taking over as lead auditor. You'll be transitioned to a support role. A support role, after 4 years of excellence. After saving them millions of dollars, after training my own replacement with my own hands. And the Morrison discrepancies, I asked. What happens to that investigation? Richard Sr. waved his hand dismissively. Bradley will review it with fresh eyes. Sometimes a new perspective is exactly what's needed. I left that meeting with my resignation letter half written in my head. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the 4 years I had invested in that company. Maybe it was the principle of watching less qualified people rise while I was pushed down. Or maybe it was something deeper, the understanding that walking away would mean letting them win. That night I sat in my apartment and made a different decision. I wouldn't resign, I wouldn't make it easy for them. I would stay, and I would watch, and I would document everything. Because I had seen something in those Morrison numbers, something bigger than $400,000, something that the Whitmores desperately didn't want anyone to find, and I was going to find it. The transition to my new support role was designed to humiliate me, and everyone in that building knew it. They moved my desk from the 7th floor to the basement, to a cramped office next to the server room, where the constant hum of machines made it impossible to think. My nameplate was removed from the floor directory. My access to client files was restricted. I was given tasks that a first-year intern could complete in their sleep. Data entry, document scanning, filing. It's just temporary, Sandra from HR told me with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Until we figure out where you fit best. I fit best exactly where I'd been for 4 years. They knew it, I knew it, but saying that out loud would have given them the excuse they needed to fire me for cause, so I stayed quiet, and I watched. Bradley's takeover of the audit department was a disaster in slow motion. Within his first week as lead auditor, he had misclassified 3 major accounts, missed a deadline for a compliance report, and sent confidential client information to the wrong email address. Any other employee would have been terminated on the spot. Bradley received a gentle reminder about attention to detail and a gift card to the steakhouse down the street. But the Morrison account was what kept me awake at night. I had saved copies of everything before my access was revoked. The payment records, the vendor invoices, the discrepancy reports. I studied them in my basement office after hours when the building was empty and the security guards were busy with their phones. And the more I studied, the more I understood. The $400,000 I had found was just the surface. The real fraud ran much deeper. The payments were being funneled through a series of shell companies, each one designed to obscure the money's final destination. The invoices were fake, created using software that generated realistic-looking documents, complete with letterheads and signatures. And the authorization codes on every single fraudulent payment traced back to one person. Caroline Whitmore. The CFO was stealing from her own company. I spent 2 weeks confirming my findings, cross-referencing bank records with corporate accounts, tracking payment patterns, building a timeline that showed exactly how the fraud had operated over the past 3 years. The total amount stolen wasn't $400,000. It was $9 million. $9 million, siphoned from client accounts and hidden behind a maze of fake vendors and doctored invoices. And the Whitmores were using my demotion to bury the evidence. I needed proof that would hold up in court. I needed documentation that couldn't be disputed or explained away. And I needed to be very, very careful about how I obtained it. The basement had one advantage that the 7th floor didn't: proximity to the archive room. That was where Whitmore kept its physical records, the paper trail that predated the digital systems. It was also where they kept documents that were too sensitive to store on the network, including original contracts, handwritten notes, and internal memos that were never meant to see the light of day. My new access badge couldn't open the archive room, but Bradley's could. I waited until a Thursday afternoon when Bradley was scheduled for a leadership development lunch with his uncle. The office was quiet, and most of the support staff had left early for a long weekend. I walked to the 7th floor, carrying a stack of folders that made me look busy, and found Bradley's desk exactly as he had left it, cluttered with papers, half-eaten snacks, and his access badge sitting next to his keyboard. He hadn't even locked his computer. I picked up the badge, walked to the archive room, and let myself in. The room was exactly what I expected: rows of filing cabinets, labeled by year and client name, stretching back 2 decades. I went straight for the Morrison files, pulling every document from the past 5 years. Then I moved to the internal accounting records, the ones that tracked payments to vendors and contractors. That was where I found it. A handwritten ledger, separate from the official books, documenting every fraudulent payment in Caroline Whitmore's own handwriting, dates, amounts, shell company names, and notes that made her involvement undeniable. I photographed every page with my phone, then returned everything exactly as I had found it. I was back at my basement desk within 20 minutes, heart pounding, evidence secured. But I wasn't finished. Over the following weeks, I became a ghost. I worked my menial tasks during the day, asking no questions, causing no problems. I became so invisible that people stopped noticing when I was in the room. And I used that invisibility to gather more evidence. I discovered that Richard Jr. was involved too. His signature appeared on bank documents authorizing the transfer of funds to the shell companies. He had set up the fraudulent vendor accounts using his own credentials, then covered his tracks by blaming processing errors on the IT department. Richard Sr. was harder to connect directly, but his fingerprints were everywhere. He had approved the budgets that made the fraud possible. He had personally overruled compliance recommendations that would have exposed the scheme. And he had orchestrated my demotion the moment I got too close to the truth. The Whitmores weren't just a family of incompetent nepotists. They were criminals. I compiled everything into a single file: the photographs, the cross-references, the timeline, the financial analysis. I made 3 copies, one on an encrypted hard drive, one on a secure cloud server, and one printed and stored in a safety deposit box. I wasn't going to give them any opportunity to destroy the evidence. Then I started planning. I knew I couldn't take my findings to the company. The Whitmores controlled every aspect of Whitmore and Associates, from HR to legal to the board of directors. Any internal report would be buried before it left my desk. I needed external validation, external authority, external consequences. I contacted the Securities and Exchange Commission anonymously, using an encrypted email service that couldn't be traced back to me. I outlined the fraud in general terms, providing enough detail to establish credibility without revealing my identity. The response came within 48 hours. The SEC was interested but needed more information before opening a formal investigation. I also reached out to a forensic accountant named Dr. Evelyn Carter, a woman I had met at an industry conference 3 years earlier. She was known for her work exposing corporate fraud, and she had no connection to Whitmore or its clients. I sent her a summary of my findings and asked for her professional opinion. Her response was immediate. "This is significant. If your documentation is accurate, you have evidence of federal crimes. You need to be extremely careful." I was being careful, but I also needed to accelerate my timeline. The opportunity came unexpectedly during a routine meeting about the upcoming annual audit. Bradley, in his infinite incompetence, had discovered that the Morrison account was flagged for SEC review as part of a routine compliance check. He mentioned it casually, as if it were nothing more than paperwork. But I saw Richard Sr.'s face when Bradley said it. I saw the flicker of fear behind his eyes, the quick glance he exchanged with Caroline. They knew the SEC review would expose everything. They started moving that same week. I watched them transfer files, delete emails, schedule off-site meetings with their legal team. They were covering their tracks, trying to bury the evidence before the SEC could find it. And they were doing it so blatantly, so desperately, that their guilt was obvious to anyone paying attention. But they had forgotten about me. They had forgotten that I still had access to the backup servers in the basement. They had forgotten that their deletions were being logged by a system I had helped design. They had forgotten that everything they destroyed, I had already copied. 3 weeks before the SEC review, I submitted my formal complaint. It was 60 pages long, meticulously documented, impossible to ignore. I included the photographs, the financial analysis, the timeline, and Dr. Carter's expert opinion. I named names: Caroline Whitmore, Richard Whitmore Jr., Richard Whitmore Sr. I detailed the fraud, the cover-up, and the retaliation I had faced for getting too close to the truth. I signed it with my real name. I was done hiding. The night I submitted the complaint, I sat in my apartment and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not hope that the Whitmores would face justice. That was still uncertain. But hope that I had done everything I could. Hope that I had refused to let them erase me. Hope that my work, my expertise, my integrity still mattered. The next morning, I walked into Whitmore and Associates knowing that everything was about to change. I just didn't know how fast. The SEC arrived on a Monday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I submitted my complaint. 6 federal agents in dark suits, carrying boxes and laptops, and the kind of authority that made everyone in the building stand straighter. They went directly to the 7th floor. Bypassing reception entirely, I watched from the basement, tracking the chaos through the security monitors I could access from my desk. The Whitmores were scrambling, Richard Sr. on the phone with lawyers, Caroline trying to access files that had already been locked, Richard Jr. pacing in circles like a man who had just realized his entire world was collapsing. Bradley was nowhere to be seen. I later learned he had called in sick that morning. Convenient timing. The first interview request came at 10:47 a.m. An agent named David Chen appeared at my basement office, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "we'd like to speak with you." I had been waiting for this moment for weeks. Of course. They took me to a conference room on the 3rd floor, away from the chaos upstairs. Agent Chen was accompanied by a woman named Dr. Rebecca Morrison, no relation to the account, she assured me, who specialized in forensic financial analysis. They had clearly done their homework. "Mr. Thompson," Agent Chen began, "we've reviewed your complaint in detail. The documentation is comprehensive." "I tried to be thorough," I said. "You succeeded." He slid a folder across the table. "We've been able to verify approximately 85% of your claims independently. The remaining 15% we're still investigating. But preliminary analysis suggests your findings are accurate." I felt my chest tighten. "What happens now?" "Now we build a case," Dr. Morrison said. "Your documentation gives us probable cause, but we need to establish a complete chain of evidence. We'll need your cooperation as a witness. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about everything I had endured over the past months. The demotion, the humiliation, the surveillance, the assumption that I was somehow lesser than Bradley Whitmore with his fraternity smile and his family connections. I thought about every time I had been interrupted, doubted, overlooked, accused. "I've been prepared for a long time," I said. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The SEC froze Whitmore's accounts within 48 hours, preventing any further transfer of funds. They subpoenaed email records, financial documents, and internal communications that the Whitmores had thought were deleted permanently. They interviewed every employee in the audit department, including Bradley, who I'm told cried during his questioning. And then they found the offshore accounts. I hadn't known about those. My investigation had traced the fraud to the shell companies, but the SEC's resources went further. They discovered that Caroline Whitmore had been funneling money to accounts in the Cayman Islands for over a decade, not just from Morrison, but from a dozen other clients. The total amount stolen wasn't $9 million, it was $47 million. The Whitmores were arrested on a Thursday afternoon, all three of them, in front of the employees they had spent years deceiving. I wasn't there to see it. I was meeting with Dr. Carter, reviewing additional evidence she had uncovered, but I heard about it later from colleagues who had watched in stunned silence. "Richard Sr. kept saying there was a mistake," one of them told me. "He kept saying his lawyers would handle it. But Caroline didn't say anything. She just looked empty." Richard Jr. apparently tried to run. He made it as far as the parking garage before two agents caught up with him. The footage from the security cameras became something of a legend in the office. I was asked to testify before a grand jury 3 weeks later. The prosecutor, a woman named Janet Williams, who had spent her career putting white-collar criminals behind bars, walked me through my findings step by step. I explained the discrepancies, the shell companies, the forged invoices, the handwritten ledger. I explained how I had been demoted for getting too close to the truth, how they had tried to use Bradley to replace me, how they had assumed I would go quietly. "Mr. Thompson," Williams said at the end of my testimony, "why didn't you just resign? Why did you stay and risk your career to expose this?" I took a moment to consider my answer. Because I knew if I left they would do this to someone else, and that person might not have the skills or the documentation or the stubbornness to fight back. I stayed because someone had to, and because I refused to let people like the Whitmores decide what I'm worth. The grand jury returned indictments on all three Whitmores: wire fraud, securities fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Richard Sr. faced additional charges for his role in covering up the scheme. Caroline was charged with money laundering for the offshore accounts. Richard Jr., in a desperate attempt to reduce his sentence, agreed to testify against his parents. The trials lasted 8 months. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery, watching the family that had tried to destroy me face the consequences of their crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was damning. The Whitmore's defense attorneys tried everything, claiming the documents were forged, suggesting I had fabricated evidence, even implying that I had orchestrated the fraud myself and framed their clients. None of it worked. Richard Whitmore Sr. was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Caroline received 18 years, with an additional 5 years for the money laundering charges. Richard Jr., despite his cooperation, was sentenced to 12 years. The judge, a 73-year-old woman named Barbara Chen, made a statement during sentencing that I will never forget. "The defendants in this case represent the worst of corporate America," she said. "They abused their positions of power. They stole from clients who trusted them, and they systematically retaliated against an employee who had the courage to speak the truth. Their greed destroyed lives and livelihoods. Their arrogance made them believe they were untouchable. Today, they learn that no one is above the law. Whitmore and Associates dissolved within 6 months of the verdicts. The remaining partners couldn't survive the scandal, and the client exodus made recovery impossible. The building that had once felt like a prison was sold to a tech company. I drove past it once after everything was over and felt nothing. But the story didn't end there. 3 months after the sentencing, I received a call from Janet Williams, the prosecutor. She told me that my testimony and documentation had inspired the SEC to launch a broader investigation into financial fraud in the auditing industry. My case was being used as a model for whistleblower protections. Congress was considering legislation that would strengthen safeguards for employees who exposed corporate corruption. "You didn't just bring down the Whitmores," she said. "You changed the system." I started my own consulting firm the following year. I called it Thompson Forensic Services, and I specialized in exactly what the Whitmores had tried to prevent me from doing, finding the truth hidden in the numbers. My first client was a small non-profit that suspected their accountant was skimming donations. I found the fraud in 3 days. My reputation grew from there. Dr. Evelyn Carter became a partner in my firm. So did 2 former Whitmore employees who had reached out after the trial, apologizing for not standing up for me when it mattered. I hired them anyway. People can change, systems can change, the world can change. Bradley Whitmore never faced criminal charges. He was deemed too peripheral to the conspiracy, but his career in finance was over. I heard he moved back to his parents' hometown in Ohio, where he manages a sporting goods store. I wish him no ill will. He was a symptom, not the disease. I think often about what it means to be a black man in America, about the ways this country tells you that you're not enough, that you don't belong, that your success is a threat to be managed rather than an achievement to be celebrated. I think about the microaggressions and the surveillance and the constant exhausting work of proving yourself in spaces that were never designed for you. But I also think about resilience, about the generations of black men and women who came before me, who faced far worse and still found ways to build, to succeed, to matter. I think about my grandfather, who worked 3 jobs his entire life so his children could go to college. I think about my mother, who raised me to believe that excellence was its own reward, even when the world refused to recognize it. The Whitmores tried to erase me. They tried to reduce me to a supporting character in my own story. They assumed that their wealth and their connections and their whiteness would protect them from consequences. They were wrong. I am Marcus Thompson. I am a forensic accountant. I am a whistleblower. I'm a black man who refused to be silent, and I won. Not because I was lucky, not because the system worked the way it should, but because I did the work. I gathered the evidence. I built the case. I trusted in my own abilities when everyone around me told me I was worthless. I won because I refused to let them define me. And that is a victory no one can ever take away.